So good evening, and welcome to the second in our series of Lonergan Workshop Contributions to the Church in the 21st Century, what's the next part? Catholic Intellectual Traditions. Very pleased to welcome tonight, for the first time as a speaker at a Lonergan event, my colleague Paul Colbert. Paul Colbert is the person in the Roman collar, and the joke is that you can tell he's not a Catholic because he's wearing a Roman collar. All the Catholic priests are in their sports shirts, etc. So, but don't be alarmed. I've never seen him in it before. And I just want to say it's a joy for me to have him here because there are so many colleagues with whom the main thing you talk about is, did you get your snow tires and the weather and so forth and so on. But Paul is always working on something very interesting and is always more than willing to share what he's working on with a person like myself. And I'm always fascinated by the tremendously interesting angles he takes on things as a patristics person, because he does what Gadamer says you ought to do, namely read these old authors as if they have something to say to some problem that we're really trying to struggle with today. And this is true of this talk as well, although he's not footnoting Augustine all the time, as he told me. And he is chiefly an Augustine scholar, and he's going to have a book appearing soon on Augustine as a pastoral theologian. So this talk is right up that alley. I was very pleased that he shared with me this talk earlier in this semester, because this is one of the dreariest subjects that there is to talk about in the wake of the great scandal of 2002. And what we realize is that this issue shows that the scandal of 2002 is just a symptom of some much deeper malaise. And there aren't very many people who actually address the deeper malaise. And one can't do it comprehensively. It's too big and too complicated, and chances are we're lost on most of the issues. But I think Paul Colbert, our speaker tonight, is really onto something in this talk, and so I'm eager to have him share it with you. Paul, welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you, Fred. Been somewhat disappointed that you gave away that I have sources. I was hoping to convince you that I made all this up, but I have learned a considerable amount from my ancient teachers. What an honor it is for me this evening to give a talk as part of the Boston College Church in the 21st Century initiative that has already done so much to ensure that the Roman Catholic Church enters this century vital and strong. There have already been several distinguished talks on issues relating to the Catholic priesthood. We've already learned that the clergy crisis is so complex and multifaceted that it is not possible to take it on all at once. My concern this evening is with the single question of the viability of the priesthood as a way of life. That is, how it can be attractive enough to attract our best and brightest young people for future leadership of the church. This evening I'm approaching the subject from a broader perspective than the previous speakers in the series. Of course, there are features of the clergy crisis that are unique to the Roman Catholic Church and its governing structure. But that is not the topic tonight. I'm an Episcopal priest worrying about the current state of Christian ministry in America, which includes the Roman Catholic Church, but it also includes everybody else. I think there are advantages to situating the Roman Catholic crisis within the broader crisis afflicting Christian ministry in America, and look forward to hearing your comments and questions afterward. My talk has 3 sections. The first one is on the nature of the crisis itself, including its sources and effects. In the second section, I address the most prevalent theological strategy for coping with the crisis and why I don't think it works. Finally, I'll set out my own proposal, which is not so much a solution to the clergy crisis as it is the best way that I can think of to have a strategy to cope with it. My proposal focuses on the recovery of the clergy's confidence in the intellectual content of their profession and the intrinsic value of its fundamental practices. So, what is the crisis of ministry in America today? Well, the most visible place to start is the fact that American clergy are aging at a rapid rate, and there are not enough ordained young people to take their place when they retire. The scarcity of young Roman Catholic vocations in the United States is perhaps the best known instance of a troubling trend afflicting everyone else too. In an earlier talk in this series, Dean Hogue explained that the number of Catholic priests has fallen 9 to 11% per decade since the 1980s, while American seminaries continue to produce clergy at between 35 and 45% of the number needed to keep the priesthood at a constant size. Consequently, the ratio of Catholic parishioners per priest has grown from 652 in 1950 to 1,453 in 2003. Fully 16% of American Catholic parishes had no resident priest in 2003, resulting in fewer masses, sacraments, and a growing number of parish closings. Even more dire is the realization that as of 1999, only 6% of the 27,000 Roman Catholic priests were under 35, meaning that the coming waves of retiring priests may only be partially replaced. Mainline Protestants, nonetheless, fare little better than Roman Catholics. As shown by a flurry of studies over the past decade by independent agencies and Christian denominations, the number of clergy under the age of 35 are variously 6% of pastors serving the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, 7% of the Presbyterian USA ministers, and less than 4% of the Episcopal priests. The second largest Protestant denomination, the United Methodist Church, reports that between 1985 and 2005, the number of ordained ministers under 35 dropped dramatically from 15.05% to 4.69%. The majority of our present clergy, Catholic and Protestant, will retire within 20 years. The shortage of young clergy is coupled with a sharply rising age of ordination. The average age of new ordinands in the Episcopal Church is 44, which has a number of discernible effects. Older ordinands serve fewer years. This means that for the number of ordained ministers to remain the same, the number of ordinations must double. It takes 2 priests who are active for 15 to 20 years to do the work of 1 priest serving 30 to 40 years. Accordingly, even if the number of ordinations remains constant, this in no way ensures that there will not be a decline in the number of available priests. Moreover, for Episcopal bishops, for example, the years of ministry between priestly ordination and Episcopal consecration are shrinking. In a time when priestly ministry begins in one's mid-40s, how can Episcopal candidates be expected first to accrue 20 years of ordained experience? The trend towards ordaining those with more life experience has resulted in the consecration of bishops with significantly less ministerial experience. Christian ministry has become, therefore, predominantly a second career, particularly for the baby boom generation. Reliance on an ongoing infusion of second career vocations, however, could well prove short-sighted. This pattern may not continue because it is unclear whether the upcoming generation or generations, mine and those that are younger than me, it's not clear whether those generations that have chosen not to pursue the ministry as a first profession will decide to follow the pattern of the baby boomers and enter it later in life. Ordaining women has increased the pool of applicants for those who have ordained women, but it has not actually solved the clergy supply problem. Recruiting young, talented women has already become as difficult as recruiting young, talented men. In addition to the real leadership needs of local Christian communities, the relative absence of both male and female young clergy vocations has implications for the future funding of clergy pensions and brings with it the temptation to lower the bar when it comes to qualifying candidates. Put frankly, with few candidates, it's tempting to be less selective, and the resulting fall-off in quality may well lead to clergy misconduct and, worse, legal entanglements. Thus, we may only be at the beginning of a crisis that could become worse, and we will not again have recourse to opening up the ordination process to sizable enough demographic groups that have previously been excluded. However one looks at it, Christian churches are facing some startling facts about their future pastoral leadership. The fact that the clergy of other similarly placed denominations are aging at roughly equal rates indicates that this crisis is the result of deep-seated developments in American society and not reducible without remainder to short-sighted policies of denominational leadership. It appears to me now that policy changes at the administrative level, such as intentionally recruiting more young people, will not in themselves be effective without addressing the actual problem in the way it affects our notions of ministry itself. In retrospect, it is possible to see that this situation has been developing for decades. In the mid-1950s, H. Richard Niebuhr published the results of a large-scale study of theological education in North America, funded by the Carnegie Corporation, in which he noted a worrisome loss of authority among ministers, but one that he was quite optimistic could be remedied. Niebuhr understood Christian ministry as one of the socially necessary professions with its own specialized skills and knowledge, standing alongside medicine and law. Without pause, he likened the minister as pastoral director to the dean of a medical school or the mayor of a city. A report presented at the 1967 General Convention of the Episcopal Church stated that in 1965, nearly 27% of its priests and deacons were then under 35. Echoing Niebuhr, the same report describes ministry as the central profession. It is the calling which helps all men and women to a proper sense of their callings. In such a climate, theological education meant the acquisition of the distinct skills requisite for a successful professional life. In the years that our current young priests were being born, an Episcopal priest could still consider himself, since we hadn't ordained women yet, a trained professional whose skills were necessary to the functioning of society, much like those of doctors and lawyers. About the same time, nevertheless, there were indications of the onset of a rapid social change. For example, a sociological study of the mid-1960s drew attention to the aging of clergy in the Church of England as if pointing to some canary in the coal mine. It describes how the loss of general standing of the clergy in relation to other professions and the diminution of their social influence has been accompanied in England by their increasing average age. This loss of general standing is attributed in no small part to advances in what it calls modern knowledge that have made the clergy more guarded and less confident in the intellectual content of their profession. The English clergy of the 1960s could be likened to the charcoal burners or alchemists in an age when the processes in which they were engaged had been rendered obsolete technically or intellectually. In this way, the fact that the religious profession has grown less attractive to young people is explained easily enough. Even if in retrospect such sentiments were overstated, subsequent analyses have time and again pointed to the 1960s as a crucial turning point in American religious life and documented lingering anxiety about the standing of ministers in relation to other professions. Such studies continually note that clergy find their roles becoming socially restricted. That is, the realm in which their decisions influence affairs public and private appears to be shrinking. As Richard Christopherson observes, The work of physicians, social workers, attorneys, scholars, professionals, and semi-professionals of all sorts has usurped much of the territory that formerly belonged to the church. And these developments have often left the clergy scurrying about looking for something to do, and not incidentally, someone to be. Already in the mid-1960s, James Gustafson noted how keenly clergy felt a troubling loss of authority. They are no longer certain what their unique function is. Worried that their traditional responsibilities are no longer as meaningful as they were in a less secular age, they add to them new responsibilities and functions in order to avoid feelings of irrelevance. Clergy thus acquired new competencies in modern psychology, political activism, and business management to offset their gnawing sense of professional irrelevance and the impotence of their traditional knowledge and skills. A sympathetic recent observer writes that the loss of status in the public realm has had a greater impact on the psyche of clergy than I suspect most would care to admit. So, part two, a strategy that I don't think ultimately works. The cultural upheaval of the late 1960s deeply penetrated the self-understanding of priests and ministers. A 1971 document produced by the Roman Catholic Synod of Bishops describes how some priests feel estranged from the movements that permeate society, unable to solve people's problems, and tied to methods which are now perhaps obsolete to meet the needs of modern mentality. The sense of social dislocation was felt nowhere more strongly than in the seminaries and university divinity schools dedicated to the training of Christian ministers. The late Henry Nouwen, a Catholic priest and Yale Divinity School professor for the crucial decade of 1971 to 1981, published more than 40 books and has been the most influential writer on the topic for decades. A recent study of what priests and pastors read found that Nouwen was the most read author by both mainline Protestant clergy and Roman Catholic clergy. In 1972, Nouwen wrote in the opening paragraph of his widely influential book, The Wounded Healer, Ministry in Contemporary Society, the ministers find the familiar ways crumbling and themselves stripped of their traditional protections. He described ministers as experiencing an undesired displacement to the edges of life, as their professional impact on others is diminishing. Nouwen worried that the words of salvation appear to the young as words from a strange and unfamiliar world. By 1989, Nouwen was already observing the crisis of young vocations and its implications. Quote, "One of the most painful realizations for many Christian leaders is that fewer young men feel attracted to follow in their footsteps. It seems that nowadays, becoming a priest or minister is no longer something worth dedicating your life to." Nouwen self-consciously offered a new model of pastoral leadership for a new day, a ministerial ideal that was decidedly post-professional. He characterized his own works as a tenacious attempt to respond to ministers who are questioning their own relevance and effectiveness. On the margins of professional life, with their seemingly irrelevant traditional skills, the identity and tasks of Nouwen's ministers can neither be tied as strongly to the professional status that he quite rightly perceived to be eroding, nor to the traditional institutions that were losing credibility. Instead of trying to prove their value and professionalism, Nouwen called ministers to embrace their new situation. He says, "I'm deeply convinced that the Christian leaders of the future is called to be completely irrelevant and to stand in this world with nothing to offer but his or her own vulnerable self." In this way, Nouwen's clergy were neither to continue to allow themselves to be overly defined by the values of their cultural context, nor feel compelled any longer to adopt professional skills foreign to their vocation. Nouwen called ministers instead to think about themselves and their roles theologically. As he asserted, without solid theological reflection, future leaders will be little more than pseudo-psychologists, pseudo-sociologists, pseudo-social workers. Nouwen's ministers were to inhabit a theologically informed ministerial ideal that gave them a sense of value, organized their various roles, and reduced the stress that comes from role ambiguity. In order for the words of salvation to appear no longer as from some strange and unfamiliar world, in his words, Nouwen searched for a means to make the ministry meaningful to a world that no longer perceived it as necessary. He found this means in life experience. By mining the depths of personal experience, Nouwen advised ministers to bring to expression universally experienced inner events in a compelling manner so that those listening would find those words to be an adequate expression of their own life experience. Ultimately, the minister offers his own experience as a source of healing. A year earlier, Nouwen wrote explicitly, "A preacher who wants to be a real leader is the man who is able to put the full range of his life experiences at the disposal of those who ask him to be their preacher. Pastoral care means, in the final analysis, offering your own life experience to your fellow man." Beyond professionalism, Nouwen suggested, was the spirituality of life experience. It's a tribute to Nouwen's perception that in important ways, more than 30 years later, his minister is more familiar to us than the one whose professional skills were placed alongside the public roles of doctors and lawyers. Comparing clergy's salaries with those of lawyers and physicians provides ample evidence that society no longer accords them the social status they once had. It has been well documented that for quite some time, religion in our culture has come to be considered a matter of private, personal preference, rather than an integral component of public life. Although offering itself as a countercultural ideal, Nouwen's model locates the priesthood precisely in the space that our culture has assigned it. This is a priest that we can understand without calling into question the most basic assumptions about the place of religion in life. Nouwen's minister is an expert in the only cultural space available to him: personal inner events. Nouwen makes something more than the ancient claim that teachers have authority to the extent that their experience and character are in harmony with what they say. Instead, for Nouwen, experience itself has its own particular capacity to bridge the gulf between ancient insights and contemporary hearers. Although this ideal is meant to ease the burden on priests by soothing their feelings of obsolescence, seeking to ground the relevance of ministry in universal life experience asks a great deal more of the clergy than is often recognized. One of the remaining privileges of ministry is the opportunity to be present at critical events in people's lives. Priests cherish the incredible series of unforgettable moments of intense intimacy they experience as they share the unique grief and joys of those for whom they care. Priests discover the day-to-day comforting of the dying and bereaved, the celebration of marriage and births, and other such moments to be both challenging and profoundly humanizing. When others demand an explanation for their own particular suffering, who would not tremble to give an answer from their own experience, even after they've unearthed it to its very depths? If it is one's life experience that makes the apparently strange and unfamiliar words of salvation relevant, no wonder it's so difficult to preach well. And no wonder that ministers just spend so much time looking for exactly the right anecdote that will connect their experience to those listening. Excluding those few virtuosos of the spiritual life, like Henry Nouwen, it may be asking impossibly too much of the minister's life experience to be the source of healing for another's soul. A ministerial ideal that has life experience at its core, moreover, does not serve us well in recruiting young clergy. Those of us who were evaluated as potential priests in our 20s were asked countless times, "Have you experienced enough suffering to relate to those in pain?" Under the force of such questioning, it became clear that we lacked what was thought to be the core of Christian ministry: life experience. After all, 25-year-olds not only lack life experience, but also in all likelihood have not had sufficient time even to understand what little bit of life they already have experienced. Even when educated theologically, what do they have to offer as a source of healing to others? How can any of them be anything other than just a novice learning on the job? Without an answer to what a 25-year-old minister has to offer to others, it is difficult to recruit them. Those contemplating life of ordained ministry may not be able to formulate the presuppositions informing the ideal they seem to fall short of at every turn, but it certainly affects what is expected of them and influences the extent to which they can imagine themselves as priests. Although placing a premium on life experience is an essential quality of effective ministry certainly did not bring about the shortage of young clergy, it has contributed to it, continues to do so, and is not an effective strategy in coping with the clergy crisis. Nouwen's advocacy of a theologically informed ministerial ideal, powerful enough to unify various clergy activities, has merit, but it needs revision precisely in its understanding of the role personal experience plays in the life of ministry. So my own proposal about a more effective way to approach this. Clergy are more difficult to recruit when we cannot promise them the economic standing and social status that were associated with the vocation when it stood with law and medicine as one of the learned professions. In a sense, then, one part of the solution has to do with paying clergy more, reducing their student loan debt, and stemming their drop in class status so that they can remain able to pay for such expenses as the higher education of their children and the care of aging parents. For Roman Catholics, of course, the financial issues are somewhat different for celibate clergy, but it is important to attend to the actual quality of life they have and what support systems are in place to promote their flourishing. But having said that, professionals, nonetheless, have most commonly been understood as the late Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis defined them, as a class of people who possess specialized knowledge that they use altruistically and not merely for financial gain. Professional status, thus, has more to do with what one knows and how one uses that knowledge than with one's salary. Rising levels of lay education demand, more than ever before, that ministers possess specialized knowledge. Even if for much of the American past, many of the most popular and successful clergy were uneducated and still taken seriously, greater education levels in the general public and among Christian laity mean that priests will need to regain their lost confidence in the intellectual content of their profession. Opting out of professional culture and its claims to specialized knowledge used for the benefit of others risks the very irrelevance and the lack of influence that most clergy fear, and Henry Nouwen sought to ease through appeals to life experience. The crisis affecting clergy is not actually so dissimilar from the crises that affect every other profession from time to time. I mean, think now these days about accounting. I mean, after Enron, it may be that lawyers do the accounting instead, and this profession evaporates, unless the accountants are able to restabilize their profession. Perhaps the fundamental question for any profession have to do with what kind of practice it is, and if this practice is valuable. Before one has doctors and lawyers, there has to be medical practice and legal practice. Priests historically have, among other things, they've been committed to particular practices of baptism, Eucharist, the reading and interpretation of Christian scripture, along with worship, prayer, fasting, giving, hospitality, confession, and forgiveness. In addition to these ordinary practices, there are those that pertain to life events such as birth, marriage, and death. Contemporary appeals that make life experience the essential element of priestly practice imply that the core practices of scripture reading, baptism, and Eucharist need to be retrieved from their culturally impotent irrelevance by a kind of external supplementation. The destabilization of the profession's identity, like every other profession, has to do with the destabilization of core ministerial practices. Any profession in such a situation, therefore, needs to recover an appreciation of its fundamental practices as intrinsically valuable, life-sustaining and life-transforming activities. Rather than striving to infuse these practices with meaning from outside the acts themselves, it is preferable to see the benefits of such practices acquired by the very doing of them. Such a notion is not unusual and is in fact typical of any activity that is highly valued by a community. Take, for example, the ideal practice of law. Novices are initially presented with manifold legal terms that they never before had imagined to be either necessary or relevant. Furthermore, the appropriate use of each of these terms has to be learned as well and involves study of prior practitioners and precedents that were established long ago. It is an important moment when a seasoned practitioner first turns to the student and says, "Now you're thinking like a lawyer." Hearing this acclamation means that you've internalized a kind of practice so that you possess a quality that is highly valued in the legal community. This quality is so difficult to obtain that it necessitates both innate talent and professional school. The unique reward of the practice is this certain quality of soul, a legal habit of mind. This quality may or may not lead to benefits external to the practice, money, power, and status. These can be achieved by other activities as well, and are not essential to the practice of law at all. The attorney who seeks through law only benefits external to the practice is insufficiently formed in the discipline. I need a lawyer joke here. There are so many of them, you can just fill in your own. The extended experience of the practice irreplaceably marks the soul as a quality of living and not merely the pursuit of a product that can be achieved by other means. Anyone who pursues a practice over an extended period of time will be formed by it and not merely informed about it. The same could be said equally of the training of doctors, musicians, athletes, and many others who ideally see their activity as intrinsically worthwhile rather than validated externally through money and fame. In being initiated into a new practice, prior understandings of oneself and one's life experience very often prove to be unhelpful. One's prior convictions functioned previously without seeing the tenets of the new practice as necessary. They are, at first, as now in thought, words from a strange and unfamiliar world. The very distance, its irrelevance to the cultural common sense, nevertheless makes it particularly relevant by presenting heretofore unknown options. The very strangeness of the new practice exposes the limitations of earlier understandings and makes possible new perceptions and new experiences, rather than merely a recognition of what one has already felt but been unable to express. To acquire facility in such a practice is an exercise that cultivates new mental habits and increases the range of available choices. The practice of law does not ask its students to translate its terms and traditions into expressions of their prior life experience, but to learn new legal categories and to imagine the world in those terms. When compared with this emphasis on the intrinsic value of particular practices, Nouwen's minister offers an overly refined product. It is as if his minister takes the rough food of life and parades it into fine bits, much as caregivers do for their infants. Anything foreign is converted into digestible form by making it immediately relevant to the hearer's pre-existing experience. By translating Christian insight into the idiom of universal experience, Nouwen's model unintentionally limits the transformative capacity of the Christian tradition, thereby blunting its critical or prophetic edge. Ministers less gifted than Nouwen, but following him, can find themselves merely representing select strands of their culture's experience and lapsing, in fact, into irrelevance. it is difficult to see how even the most able practitioners who fully embody Nouwen's ideal will not truncate the Christian tradition by omitting those elements that fall outside of their own experience. The experience that is most relevant, then, is not the minister's prior life experience, but the experience of all Christians thinking, learning, and loving as they practice the faith together. Focusing on the fruitful capacity of the practices themselves invites participants into the process at an earlier point than in Nouwen's model. In this way, the work of Christian ministers appears more like the work of introductory language teachers. A young minister, though lacking life experience, can be a faithful steward of baptismal waters, the spiritual food of Holy Communion, the life-giving words of Scripture, and the other elements of the practices that constitute the Christian way of life. Such ministers guide others in acquiring facility and skill through exercises where they have their own experiences. Those who taught us language gave us useful tools of expression, but exercised very little control over what we composed. In fact, they could never write for us. In the same way, faithfully and persuasively passing on spiritual practices does not guarantee outcomes nor solve life's problems, but it does equip one to live a life that is Christian. This notion of the importance of the personal involvement of the laity in no way diminishes the professional value of ministers. The practice of law and medicine do not depend entirely on the skills of the attorney or doctor. Often the legal or medical result depends in a large part on the level of participation of clients and patients in the process. Careful gathering of personal records or enthusiastic participation in physical therapy may make all the difference in the ultimate outcome. For this reason, attorneys find themselves explaining arcane points of law, much as doctors describe medical physiology to clients. These explanations include advice about the appropriate course of action to be taken. On the one hand, results are not always favorable, and attorneys, doctors, and those they serve may all be disappointed with particular outcomes, yet without losing faith in the intrinsic value of legal or medical practice. On the other hand, the investment of clients and patients can also lead to unanticipated positive outcomes. In the same way, it is delightfully common for late participants to bring their own knowledge and their own expertise to their hearing of a minister's interpretation of Scripture, and to learn something that was not said or even known by the preacher. The practices of the Christian faith, engaged in jointly by clergy and laity, are themselves forms of theological reflection. It is not the case that theology consists of a body of theoretical conclusions that are thought first and then subsequently applied later. Christian practices are themselves means of inquiry into the truth about God and the universe. Faith seeks understanding. The most significant truths have never been reducible to verbal propositions, but have always been best known through the ongoing struggle to know. The traditional practices of priests place the search for truth within a specific context which orders it toward the love of God and neighbor. From a Christian perspective, the ordering effects of Christian practices does not inhibit intellectual inquiry, but in fact opens it up and directs it to the human good, a process known in earlier times as Christian humanism. Advances in scientific knowledge and technical mastery that continue at an astonishing pace arguably make the traditional skills of priests all the more necessary. Exercises that subject our prejudices and self-interest to critique and order our technological advances toward the human good matter a great deal within the broader mechanization and depersonalization of advanced industrial society and the ongoing threat of horrific violence. In this way, Christian practices give form to human knowing, longing, and suffering, rather than providing a solution to them. The human drama of choice, feeling, and risk remains incumbent on each individual, but it occurs in the context of what we Anglicans call common prayer. The daily exercise of reading for Scripture, for example, involves making intellectual judgments about the actual meaning of any particular scriptural text and gaining facility in making the same kind of judgments about the world. To do so requires unlearning one's assumptions about the way things are, as the presence of these presuppositions become apparent when they get in the way of understandings of both Scripture and the world. In giving themselves to such a demanding activity, practitioners begin to perceive themselves and the world in terms of the ever-unfolding Christian theological tradition that they are to embody. The distinctive vocabulary in terms of this tradition is as elaborate and as difficult to master as those of law and medicine. Those engaging in the practice of interpreting Scripture are confronted in the opening words of Genesis with the fact of their raw, finite materiality, but also called to see it as divinely created, purposeful, and capable of expressing a truthful love that is not finally overcome by suffering. Likewise, truly to understand so central a biblical story as that of the Exodus from Egypt is to become aware of the manifold physical, cultural, and mental determinants that enslave the interpreter. Part and parcel of the struggle to comprehend the details of this particular narrative is being presented with the liberating waters of the Red Sea in the hope of freedom in the land of promise. Other Christian narratives and practices are equally challenging and richly reward the disciplined quest of understanding. This emphasis on the intrinsic value and transformative capacity of practices implies the inner attentiveness emphasized by Nouwen, but makes more explicit the public and political dimension of Christian faith. Anyone regularly reading Scripture will be faced with the text's repeated concern for the poor, the sick, the aliens, the widows, the orphans. Christian practices are activities that set human bodies in motion, thereby organizing material space and influencing the broader human community. Given the widely studied atrophying of local and civic institutions and the general attenuation of communal ties in American life, the weakening of professional ministry is far more ominous for society than the disappearance of charcoal burners and alchemists. The political scientist Robert Putnam asserts in a famous study, quote, "Faith communities in which people worship together are arguably the single and most important repository of social capital in America, providing an important incubator for civic skills, civic norms, community interests, and civic recruitment. The elusive sense of belonging to a community is not gained merely by association or even by occupying the same space, but grows organically out of shared practices that promote higher loyalties." In searching for a solution to America's declining social capital, Putnam concludes, faith-based communities remain such a crucial reservoir of social capital in America that it's hard to see how we could redress the erosion of the last several decades without a major religious contribution. Christian ministry is inescapably local and tied to neighborhood communities and initiatives. The availability of information via books, radio, television, webcasts, and the internet has made the opinions of experts accessible to many people. But these are no substitute for local ministry. An expert may write about prayer, but not pray with you. There is an infinite distance between talking about prayer and praying, learning about worship and worshiping, knowing Scripture and interpreting it in community, understanding despair and personally incarnating hope, analyzing social problems and feeding the poor in the church basement. Through such socially embedded activities, Christian ministers are bearers of potent, formative practices that bring about present-day communities linked to all those with similar commitments, living and dead. So to conclude, if ministers are to be experts in their own practices who are able to keep pace with the intellectual and moral needs of society, there will need to be greater investment in theological education and priestly formation by churches and the ministers themselves. Assessing the state of the literature on ministry, Matthew Price describes how expertise in professions such as medicine is gained through lengthy, rigorous training that most Masters of Divinity programs fail to provide. He then asks a question not answered in the literature. What would a church look like that really cared about standards of professional performance? It is a question whose time has come. For this reason, Boston College's recent initiatives are so timely and important. I'm thinking especially of our Professional School of Theology and Ministry that is coming about through our reaffiliation with Weston Jesuit. The clergy crisis means that the form of Christian leadership is changing along with our notions of what Christian ministry is. As alarming as the facts recited earlier are, they present the churches with an opportunity. The more value a practice is socially ascribed, the more external benefits tend to accumulate to it. On the one hand, this provides the institutional bearers of the practice with the financial and social security that are necessary for its continuance. On the other hand, the more benefits external to a practice become associated with it, the more a practice risks being corrupted. When a practice is compromised in this way, its intrinsic benefits are not achieved. Rather than fostering a quality of soul, there remains only a kind of decadent preoccupation with money, prestige, and power. The ministry's recent lost, easy relationship with society as one profession among the others creates problems for the institutions that sustain Christian practices because they require external goods. For this reason, displacement from power presents a number of unwanted challenges. But it is not entirely a negative phenomenon. Power, by definition, subjects things to its influence. Perhaps the ministry, having been weaned off a steady diet of professional perks, will not be as readily co-opted by the influence of such power. Emerging in its newer, humbler form, it may embody a Christianity that is more itself, more critical of its surroundings, and more willing to speak a language as relevant as it is foreign. To do this, it will have to have confidence in the intrinsic value of its practices and assert itself with undiminished intellectual content and moral force. Church and society each need such Christian leadership, the kind of leadership to which young people might dedicate their lives. Thank you.